Hello, welcome to my presentation on nutrition and how it can enhance both performance and if we have a look, the key knowledge that you need to know is nutritional strategies used to enhance performance and recovery. This includes carbohydrate loading, application of the glycemic index, carbohydrate gels, protein supplementation and caffeine supplementation. You also need to know hydration techniques, including the consumption of water, the different types of sports drinks known as hypotonic and isotonic drinks, and the use of IV drips in rehydration. This particular presentation is going to focus on just a general introduction to nutrition itself. Then the next one will look at hydration, and then the one after that, the dietary supplements, so looking at these dietary supplements listed here. And then the last one will actually look at applying these nutritional strategies to an endurance or an anaerobic style training program. So the key skills are all listed there for you, so feel free to go through them in your own time. Now, the nutritional strategies to enhance performance. Good nutrition is essential for good health. Here we can see that everybody needs good nutrition, good hydration, particularly those engaged in training to maximise their performance. And it also brings about their optimal chronic training adaptations. If they are not adequately nourished and hydrated, that will impede those chronic adaptations such as capillarization around the muscles, greater left ventricle size, increased blood flow, because obviously the blood's mostly made up of water. So it's essential for those training adaptations to take place to make sure you're well nourished and well hydrated. And then, of course, to maintain your health long-term and short-term. If our nutritional and hydration needs are not met, it can then result in fatigue. So looking at there are 6 main nutrients. Those that provide energy are your carbohydrates, your fats, and your proteins. Now, there are the other nutrients. Vitamins and minerals look at just maintaining good health. Water is essential. We'll look at the roles of water soon. And carbohydrates, a type of carbohydrate called fibre is essential for good gut health, as well as providing feelings of fullness. So if we go to have a look at energy balance, so when energy intake equals energy expenditure, then we have an energy balance that's achieved. So we're taking in the amount that we're using up of energy. However, when we actually consume more energy than what we use up, this will result in excess weight. Whereas when we engage in more energy expenditure, we're using more energy than what we consume, this will result in us being underweight. So let's have a look at carbohydrates. So carbohydrates is essential. We know through when we did food fuels that carbohydrates are essential in order to maintain high intensity activity. We cannot work at a high intensity or it's predominantly used beyond 65% of the max heart rate. It is the predominant fuel source beyond that intensity. Otherwise, we won't be able to perform at our optimal. Now, carbohydrates, when we consume them and they travel in the blood as glucose. That's their smallest building block. Whereas when we don't use up the glucose and it needs to be stored in the muscles and the liver, we get these glucose molecules bonding together to form glycogen. So that's how it's stored in the muscles and the liver. And then, of course, if we get excess, that means that it ends up being stored as adipose tissue around the skin. Now, carbohydrate depletion is a major cause of fatigue. And it can have the following effects. So there's this condition called hypoglycemia, which is basically low blood glucose. And some symptoms of that are when you can't concentrate. So you get a reduction in concentration, you feel lightheaded, you can shake, you get very hungry, and our brain needs a constant supply of glucose. We always maintain our supply of glucose to the brain so to avoid this condition of hypoglycemia. Also, not consuming adequate amounts of carbohydrates can result in overtraining, where we feel that constant state of fatigue. Also, it inhibits our chronic training adaptations. So if we have consecutive training sessions, we will not get those adaptations if we do not consume enough carbohydrates. It's essential in order for those chronic adaptations to occur, because the carbohydrate stores allows us to work at a higher intensity. So therefore optimizing our training, which therefore optimizes our chronic training adaptations. And also insufficient consumption of carbohydrate impairs the immune system. So here's our guidelines for carbohydrate intake. You don't necessarily need to know these numbers. What you do need to know is that the more you're engaged in an endurance program, the more carbohydrate stores you need. And that's obviously in order to fuel that sort of exercise for long durations, where the energy expenditure is very, very high. So if we look here, if you're engaged in minimal amount of exercise, what you need is 2 to 3 grams for every kilogram of your body mass. So say, for instance, you are a 60 kilogram person. That means that you would need a total of approximately 120 grams of carbohydrates per day. Whereas if you're engaged in light exercise, say for instance you are a 70 kilogram person, 7 4s are 28, so that means you would require approximately 280 grams of carbohydrates per day. Whereas if we have a look down here, if you're an extreme endurance athlete, you're doing a cycling tour where you're engaged in 6 to 8 hours per day, then you would need, and say for instance you're a 60 kilogram athlete, you would need 600 grams of carbohydrates for the day. And just to give you an idea, 50 grams of carbohydrates is provided in a honey sandwich or a large can of baked beans. So it can be really difficult to consume 600 grams of carbohydrates in a day. And so a lot of the time the endurance athletes have to really focus on an adequate nutrition plan. And sometimes they find it really difficult to consume enough. So, and they don't have the opportunity when they're on the bike for those sorts of durations. So some of them do go on IV drips, and we'll talk about that a bit later. So you need to understand the glycemic index. You've got to be able to apply the glycemic index, which we'll look at in a later video. But before we do that, just to understand and go over glycemic index, remember a high glycemic index is a food of an index out of 100, so it's more than 70. And what that indicates here, you can see this high glycemic index peak, is the rate at which glucose is released from the gut or the intestine and the stomach into the bloodstream. So here, high glycemic index foods, so you look at jasmine rice, white bread, jelly beans. So those sorts of foods, if you were to eat them, you would get a rapid rise in blood glucose very quickly, because it's rapidly absorbed from the stomach into the small intestine. And with that, because you get a high blood glucose level, that means that you will produce a lot more insulin, which is the hormone that's released by the pancreas that unlocks the cells or unlocks the cell membrane that allows glucose to travel into the cell to fuel the cell. So that means you get a lot of production of insulin with these high glycemic index foods, whereas a low glycemic index is anything out of 100 less than 55 GI. And that allows for a lower and more sustained release of glucose into the blood. So that means that there's not such a rapid release of insulin as well, which is good for long-term health. So here you can see the GI value of a few different selected foods. So I mentioned jasmine rice, white bread before. You've also got watermelon, sports drinks, white potatoes. In comparison to low GI foods, which are most fruits and veggies, pasta, whole grain bread, the grainier it is, generally the lower the GI, brown rice, lentils, fish, eggs, meat, apple and orange juice. And then if we look in the middle, medium GI basmati rice, ice cream, couscous, a ripe banana. Generally speaking, the way in which you cook a food also changes the GI. So sweet potatoes can become more high GI if they're baked, whereas if they're boiled, they tend to be a lower GI. Now we'll look at protein. So there's limited research available on protein requirements for athletes, but the general view is here that additional protein is only required in small amounts. So that's having extra amounts of protein, but you only need small amounts of extra protein during heavy training, and it is required by both anaerobic and endurance athletes. Most athletes satisfy their protein requirements in their daily diet. And that's through eating foods that are nutrient-rich foods. So that means foods high in nutrients, so such as fruits, vegetables, meats and meat products. So they're high in nutrients as well as providing energy. Whereas if you have foods that are just energy-dense foods, such as hot chips, if you have lollies, they're very low in nutrients, but very high in energy. Strength athletes require additional protein in the earlier stages of their intensive training because that's when they're really working at improving muscle hypertrophy. That is actually where you increase the cross-sectional area of the muscle, so making the muscle bigger. And in order to do that, you do require higher amounts of protein in your diet because our muscles are made up of protein. So if you think about our skeletal muscle, so our biceps, our quadriceps, think about smooth muscle being our small intestine, stomach. They are also muscle, as well as our cardiac muscle, which is our heart. They are all made up building blocks of proteins, different amino acids that form different proteins in the body. So it is essential to make sure we have enough protein in order to maintain our cell division of those different building blocks and different structures. Hormones as well are made of proteins. So it's essential that we have enough protein in our diet. And obviously, if we're wanting the muscle size to get bigger, particularly in earlier stages, we do require a higher degree of protein in the diet. Endurance athletes also require protein. The reason being is because they do tend to use it as an energy fuel in oxidation when they're doing very long durations, but also to promote the repair of body tissues because at the end, during their event, they'll be getting micro traumas, which is basically small tears of the muscle fibers. So in order to enhance the regeneration of those muscle fibers, we require a high degree of protein. Here we can see some bodybuilders who hypertrophy is very important to them. They get graded on how big their muscles are, how low their body fat is. And generally speaking, it's considered to be excessive if you consume more than 2 grams of protein per kilogram of your body weight. Now, excess protein, if you consume excess protein for extended periods of time, it can result in some different conditions here. So it can result in displacement of the other nutrients. So in other words, you are replacing carbohydrates, vitamins, minerals, fibre if you consume foods constantly full of protein such as red meat, chicken, eggs, dairy products, which of course do have other nutrients as well, but they are particularly high in protein and it may displace carbohydrates. And in fact, carbohydrates, they are important because they actually assist the body in building new tissue and muscle mass. So it's essential that people trying to gain muscle mass and hypertrophy do need to consume more carbohydrates as well. We also by consuming too much protein, it can mean that we may consume too many saturated fats because animal foods such as meats and dairy products are high in saturated fats, which are the sticky fats that stick on the walls of the arteries, which can be dangerous and bad for your health. And then another long-term effect of excessive amounts of protein is an increase in the loss of calcium in the urine. This weakens bones and then can lead to conditions such as osteoporosis. And it can also accelerate the progression of pre-existing kidney disease. Now, I haven't talked about fats as well, but fats are important for, they make up fat-soluble vitamins, they're important for insulation, they are a component of our cell membranes. So it is important that we do eat sufficient amounts of fat, and generally speaking, about 20% of our energy needs should come from fat sources, as we do need them in our diet. I hope that's been a good introduction for you for nutrition.